everybody, and welcome to the Payments Podium. Today, we're going to have a very lively conversation about the core. I get a lot of questions online about what is a core, what does it do, why do we need one, what's the future of cores look like, all kinds of stuff. It's really important to understand. I mean, the core is at the core of banking. But to be able to help us understand that, I have Ron Suhr here with me today. Ron, would you please say hi to everybody?
Good morning, afternoon, wherever you are, everybody.
All right, Ron. First question I got to ask you, because I ask this about everybody that comes on the Payments Podium, is how did you get started in electronic banking? It's usually a fun question to ask people because not many, actually only one person ever has said, I went to school for it. I played banker when I was a kid. It's what I wanted to do my whole life. Other than that, everybody else usually has an interesting story for how they ended up in this field.
Well, I guess my roots start out again growing up wanting to be a banker because my dad owned a bank growing up as a kid. So started off young, as most nepotism kids do in banks, shredding paper, pulling weeds, mowing yards. And by the time I graduated from college, I was a loan officer, assistant cashier, and helping my dad out with lots of different things. And then he sold the bank, and then I had to go find a real job. And an opportunity presented itself to come here where I'm at today. And when my dad owned the bank, was actually a customer of our company, and my previous company president, who retired back in October, was actually the sales rep that called on my dad. So I've actually been with the company now 10 years. And back when I started in banking, there wasn't electronic banking. So I've seen the evolution over the last 35 to 40 years as it's all kind of come together.
All right, so this is great. You're number two. You're the second person that says I grew up wanting to be into banking. So you grew, and it's like you grew up in banking, is what I heard too.
Yes.
And you actually worked with a bank because that's something else that is unique for people in electronic payments. A lot of people have never worked actually at a bank. I mean, I find some, of course, that have. I personally, I've never worked at a bank or credit union, but I have worked for banks and credit unions at banks or credit unions many times on their behalf, but I was never actually an employee of one. Now, you also mentioned something really key, whereas you worked in this industry before it became all electronic. You're with Modern Banking, correctly, which is a core provider.
Correct.
Okay, and a core provider, can you just start us off by explaining what is a core?
To make it simple, a core is basically an electronic database for the accounting system for the bank. So it doesn't matter if it's modern banking, if it's Fiserv, if it's FIS, CSI, the smaller family owned cores out there. It's basically a database. So all of the transactional information that used to be handwritten on paper ledgers is now entered into that database, and it handles all of the accounting for the bank, their general ledger accounts, who's got money deposited where, how much is invested, what's in Fed funds, where it's all at.
You mentioned a couple other brands of well, databases, cores that are out there. How many different types or cores would you say there actually are in the industry? Because I couldn't answer that. I mean, I would just have to speculate. How many would you think there are?
And that's a tough question because I'm sure there's some out there that I don't know about that are smaller. But if you look at all the big boys and us smaller ones out there, there's probably 25 to 30 plus. Some of the big boys have multiple cores. They
Right.
have multiple cores on the community banking side. They have it for like the really big banks, as far as like your Chase, Bank of Americas, and they also deal in the credit union space. We at Modern
And
Banking are
some of them
just
actually build their own too, which is insane to think of.
yes. And I used to work for a company based out of here in Omaha that called on some of those larger banks, and they had their full IT staffs, and they developed and had their own core and managed it internally with a staff of a couple hundred people.
Wow. See, I that's something else I'm trying to help people to understand is you don't see anything proprietary. Like for example, if I look at cell phones, okay, you look at cell phones, you do have Samsung, you do have Google, you do have Apple, but that's about it. And there might be some differences in between them, but there's not a whole lot. Like I can quantify how many there are. But if you get to something like core systems within a financial institution, there are some specific for different sizes. There are some that are specific for banks versus credit unions too. And that's something I think people need to be able to understand that what a core is and what it does is also somewhat unique to the financial institution. Is that something you agree upon, or would you say or explain it differently?
No, I would agree with that. Smaller banks don't need everything that a big bank does. Smaller banks don't typically have some of the regulatory issue that the publicly traded banks have. Um, from the perspective of different products and services being offered. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, they offer credit cards. A lot of community banks don't offer credit cards, they offer debit cards. So, of course, there's a different part of the core that would play into that. So, it just depends on the bank's end user customers, what it is that they're wanting, and what products they're pushing for is what the banks offer.
Okay, now a little side note here. I'm going to get us back on track, I promise. Because you did mention, that hey, banks and credit unions don't always offer credit cards, and I've had people go, but I got my bank or credit union name on my credit card, and I'm trying to tell them, no, no, no. What they're doing is actually offering that through somebody else, and it's just branded with their logo.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that as well?
Yes.
Okay. But if it is truly offered from a bank or credit union, coming directly from them and not just branded or a service they're paying for, that also is information that has to be able to hit the core, right?
Correct.
Okay. So would it be right to say a core keeps track of everything that happens to every account within a financial institution?
I would say that's correct. Yes.
So that is why it is so important. So, okay, like for example, what you and I can remember the days of getting paper statements.
Mm-hmm.
Was the core part of getting a paper statement?
Yes. And it still
Okay.
is today because there are people that still get paper statements. The older demographics out there that may not have internet banking or may not have the cell phone digital banking, they still want their paper statements. A lot of businesses want their paper statements to go to their accountants to reconcile checking accounts. So you still see both out there.
Well, even the electronic statement that I see online, it's still coming from the core, correct?
Correct.
So any debit, any credit from any payment channel, it goes across the core.
Correct.
Questions coming up a lot nowadays is, okay, with like FedNow or RTP, you have to be able to instantly post or have these transactions appear. Does that require also a direct connection to the core for those systems to function as expected?
I mean, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but yes.
I'm all right with going in a little bit more complicated because that's the reason why I'm bringing it up is I'm explaining people that there's this, it does eventually have to happen.
Yes.
As we've already, said, everything that goes into the core, everything that happens to somebody's account goes through the core. So with the instant payments, though, isn't it true that there are different ways of how they can touch or connect to the core to make that happen?
That is correct. A lot of that's based on security, where the third party payments that are coming in from out there, nobody wants a third party to have direct access into the core. So there's different firewalls, different servers, things that are set out in DMZs outside of the core that grab the information from the core and feed it to those third parties for the instant payments.
Something else question that comes up with all of this that involves a core, how often do cores, let's say, get upgraded and have changes done to them?
Oh, it's constant. We do major releases 3 times a year, basically. A lot of our development is driven by our customers. We have a advisory board that puts together a list at the beginning of every year of what's important, what they're seeing out there, and what they want developed. So we develop around that. But there's also a lot of regulatory parts that come in, especially at year end, making sure that any laws that have changed from the Fed or any regulatory items that need to be addressed out there are programmed and put into the core. So the reporting that comes out at year end is correct. Tax information, all the different things that happened with COVID, the PPP loans, different things like that, that it was a once in a lifetime thing, we hope, but there was custom program that needed to be done with that.
All right, that brings up something huge that I hope people are hearing and understanding too. Because a lot of times I'll have people say, hey, there's going to be this new rule. Why are we waiting 2 years for it to go into effect? And I'll explain to them it is because we have to, at all different levels of the industry, test to make sure everything works. And without a doubt, within the core as well, just for the reasons that you stated, for those regulatory type changes, and to make sure it doesn't break anything else.
Exactly. One minor change, you think everything is working good, but yet it blows up something on the other end. So
I tell people from my software days that I've seen it to where we just put a button on a screen and it took us 6 months to figure out all the things it broke.
exactly, it's a daisy
I,
chain effect, unfortunately.
unfortunately. Something else you mentioned too. You've been around since before electronic banking. Were there electronic database, computer based cores in banks before we had all this online banking that we have now?
Yes. Started off, the first one that I can remember as a kid growing up was an old Texas Instruments mainframe. And the cash letter would show up by a courier every day. They'd open up the vestibule at the bank and they'd drop off a metal case. And then that case would come in and it would have all of the physical checks when the checks were still being routed around to all the banks. And we wouldn't, the operations department would key everything into the core, and then once everything was done, all the reports would start printing on the like 11 by 17 green bar paper. Someone needed to know what their account balance was. So you'd have to flip through and find their account and tell them that's what their balance was as of last night. And
Yeah,
then,
as of a certain time too,
yes,
not as of right now.
no,
I mean, that's another thing I think that is a great example in that right there, and what you explained is the reporting, the capabilities of what we have are as of right now versus as of like a certain time period.
exactly. Because banks typically still to this day have a cutoff time where you go in and you make a deposit. Doesn't matter which bank you're going to, there's probably a funds availability policy that's sitting up there in the teller line that says any transactions after 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock will not be recognized until the next business day. In the meantime, as they're doing those transactions, they're allowing you access to some of that money, or they're memo posting it to the core so you can have access via internet banking or debit card. But in the meantime, that transaction doesn't hard post until the end of the day when they're closing out that day's business and starting the next day's business.
Oh, you just loaded me up with a couple of really big questions that I get a lot, believe it or not. But before I go to those, I want to ask one more of the history of cores. Now, I know you weren't around there at this time, but just so people can understand and be grateful for what we have, before there was the electronic core, what was happening in a bank? How was all of this done at that point in time
Oh,
before we actually had the computer based stuff?
there was, and this is kind of where modern started. We were in our 60th year this year. The I'm trying to remember the exact terminology, postronic machines or positronic machines, where there was basically a file cabinet that had a bunch of cards in the machine. So when the cash letter would come in and I wrote a check for $100 that day, they'd pull the card out and they'd stick it in the machine and they'd type in $100, and the machine would figure out, okay, I had $500 in my account. I just withdrew 100. There's $400 left. It would put everything on that card, and then you take it out and put it away. Then you do the next one and the next one. Prior to that, there were paper ledgers. Basically, the general ledger in these old books, and some of that is permanent history at banks. So if banks have been around for 150 years and you go digging around in their records vault in the basement, you're going to find these old ledger books from the late 18, early 1900s. It has people's accounts and whenever anything would come in and go. So the electronic side of things has made banking more real time, a lot more as society has changed. Wanting instant gratification with access to data has made that a lot easier. But then again, it's also brought in a bunch of nefarious actors for hacking accounts and doing different things like that. So, pros and cons.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of pros and cons, but I still think it is fascinating to know where it was, where it is now, and it blows my mind. But there's two terms you also mentioned earlier that I hear a lot: memo post and hard post. And the thing is, for me too, having been in this industry for so long and being at different financial institutions, I've heard these words used differently. So can I hear Ron's version? Because I don't want to say this is the industry accepted version, but let's hear, what would you say if somebody asked, what's memo posting versus a hard post?
So a memo post would be something that could be written to their account before the end of the day. So if I was to come in and put a deposit into my account, before all the electronics, I wouldn't have availability to those funds until that check actually went out to the bank that it was drawn on and come back, then those funds would be available. With more of the real time things going on in today's society, a memo post is as soon as I deposit that check and run it across the teller line, it gets memo posted to the system if a bank is running real time. Not all banks are, but I could get onto my internet banking and see that that money is available in the account, or I could go to the ATM and withdraw money and get my receipt that shows my balance, and it will be reflected there. But the issue with it being memo posted is if that check goes out and it comes back as overdrawn, unpaid, account closed, then that money comes back out of my account. And then the bank charges me a fee because I used money that really wasn't mine. So that money truly isn't yours until it is hard posted at the end of the day, when it is confirmed that the funds were available at the bank where it came from, and the funds have been transmitted from that location, or if it's internal on us, it came from your account to my account because we bank at the same place, then those funds are actually mine.
See, I've always explained it that in a way that basically memo posting is what's about to happen and should happen to an account, and hard posting is what has already happened.
Yeah, that's okay. So I made it a long story.
Yeah, well, that's a professor. It's like it's my gift. It's what I'm supposed to do to help people understand this. What your example is much better because it actually gives a story, gives an example people can relate to, and I like that a lot. But I do want to just let people know too. Just because something is hard posted to an account does not mean that it cannot be returned or undone, especially in the world of checks, because you can have a check that comes back a week or two later that has had problems that it could be still come back out of your account. But hard posting is more of a guarantee of the funds are yours to be able to be spent.
Yes.
But there's always the exceptions.
And those happen every day.
Right. Now, something else that we hear in the industry from time to time is I'll hear people say, we have to bring our core down every night. Now, I'm not saying that's something that happens with your cores, but when somebody's talking about they have to bring their core down every night, or they have to roll over or flip over the core, what is really happening in that situation?
That's kind of interesting because there are small town community banks out there that are still not connected to the internet, other than going and grabbing their cash letter from their correspondent bank. What they will do is at the end of the day, when they're done processing and everything is balanced and taken care of, they will literally shut that IBM or server down for the night, and it sets dormant overnight. And then the next day, they bring it up and go from that perspective and start going again. As far as a reason to do that, the only thing I can think is that you're not connected to the internet and there's nothing coming and going. With the use of debit cards, with internet banking out there, that information, that core needs to be up and running so people can have access to their balances at that point in time.
Well, and
Sometimes,
I love too that you mentioned that the use of debit cards and credit cards and how they're being used, ATM machines too. When I explain to people with these instant payments, we've already been doing it for years
yes,
because that's exactly what's happening with your debit and ATM cards is it's actually doing it in a real time type situation. So we've been doing it for years. It's not new.
yes,
I, can I go to a little scary place when it comes to cores?
sure.
Why do people get so upset? I mean, you want to see somebody get emotional, you just say the words core conversion. When you talk about core conversion, why is that such a nightmare for so many people?
Well, there's lots of different aspects to look at from that. You can look at it from an executive management perspective, from the officer side of things, because of the cost associated with doing it. Getting out of core contracts and switching to another core, there is a lot of money involved. A core is a database, but it is proprietary to each core provider. The layout of that database, where the information is found. So there are deconversion costs for canceling contracts and leaving and wanting access to that data. And then moving to another core, there's conversion costs. From an operational perspective, where a lot of the heavy lifting is done in the bank with the people in the back rooms, um, Some of them have been at some of these smaller banks 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They don't like to change. They can basically buzz through, they know right where everything's at. So there's a big fear of change. People don't like making change. So that's where a lot of the fear is associated with that. And as part of it is the unknown. Again, they don't know what they don't know. So there's a lot of things that cores can do. People will reach out and say, "Well, I need training on the core." Well, for what? Well, I don't know. You can't train that. You need to turn around and say, "Well, I talked to a peer at another bank and they're able to do this." Well, 9 times out of 10, most cores can do that. They just never have in the past and don't know how to ask for it. But the biggest fear is, like I said, change. Nobody likes change unless
Well,
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Unless they get pushed to the point where they're getting priced out by their current core, the service is not there, and they're having problems. The officers, the executives of the bank really don't pay much attention to that until the people in the back room start complaining. We've got problems. Then they start their
Well,
due
I've
diligence.
always used this as the analogy for understanding why people get so terrified of changing a core. Imagine you're driving a Corvette down the road, and the core is your engine of that Corvette. And while it's driving down the road, you have to take that engine out and put a Ford engine into that Corvette, because that is what it can be like sometimes, because you can't stop. You still have to stay up and be operational, even though I know a lot of conversions will take place, starting on a Friday night through the
Yes.
weekend to try and accommodate it so much, but it's still, activities happening.
Yes. And that's why it's a long process to get done. Files are cut ahead of time. Files are loaded into whichever core it's going to. Testing takes place, but that, like you said, on that Friday, at the end of business on that Friday, all the GL accounts balance, and then the new core needs to make sure that everything that ends here on core A is exact balance in core B going forward.
Okay, one last question I really have for you. And this has been great learning about cores, the a little history, what they do, what they can do. But what's the future of cores look like? Like, they've evolved a lot over the years, obviously. What do you see the future of core banking to be, or the future of cores? What does that look like?
Oh, see, that's tough because it's not actually the core itself, but it's all the ancillary products that come to the core. A core is a database. A core is a ledger book that things come and go from. It's all the different pieces that plug in, like the ATM, debit cards, internet banking, credit cards, teller systems, marketing systems that are built upon customer data. All of that information is what's kind of adding to the core. A lot of things you're hearing out there is the AI going into the core. That's scary. Seeing things where, I guess if I was a college student nowadays and I could ask Siri or an AI to turn around and write a paper for me because I went out last night and didn't get it done in time, I'm sure that that's probably been done. But with that, it opens up a lot of security issues of what's happening out there in today's society. You can get a phone call from someone that's AI. You think it's coming from the bank, and it's not. You give them the information. Next thing you know, they're in your account. So, as far as the future of cores, I think the security is going to be the biggest issue. How these ancillary products plug into the core to protect your information and your money.
Wow, and that's just amazing. Because you're right, you nailed it back to the definition, like where we started. But it is really everything surrounding it, but the core will still be there to support it. Well, Ron, I want to thank you for being on the Payments Podium, because this has been enlightening. Again, these are questions I get on a regular basis, and I'm so grateful that we can put this out there to answer it for everybody. And if you guys watching or listening want to be able to get a hold of Ron, can we find you on LinkedIn?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. That's just
Okay, Ron Suhr with Modern Banking. You'll be able to find him on LinkedIn.
correct.
And if there's, go ahead.
That's correct.
All right. And I do want to end by saying, if there is a topic, or if there's maybe a speaker that you think should be on the Payments Podium, make sure to email me, Kevin at paymentsprofessor.com. I'll do my best to make sure that we get that speaker or we get that topic addressed, because we're here to answer all your questions. But this is the part where I get to say to everybody, class dismissed.